In the next panel on the impact of COVID-19, we will meet Frances Arnold, Nobel Prize Laureate in Chemistry in 2018, Asha Kanwar, President and CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning, and Daphne Koller, co-founder of Coursera. But first, Akinwumi Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank Group, in a conversation with Adam Smith about the impact of COVID-19 on Africa.
So, Akinwumi Adesina, welcome. Now, your position at the African Development Bank gives you a unique overview over the continent. So, how would you describe the impact of COVID-19 on education in Africa?
Well, I mean, it's been a real terrible disaster for everybody around the world. But in case of Africa, let me break that into three things. One, in terms of spending on education, in terms of enrollment on education, and in terms of performance on education. In terms of spending on education, it has really significantly affected allocations to the educational sector because the monies have just gone into the other sectors like health and all that are very much needed and social protection. Now, the financing gap for education still remains about $40 billion, and that has simply gotten worse. Now, in terms of enrollment, if you take a look at it, because of the lockdowns that you have, increased lack of income by people, and the fact that a lot of the children of the poor have suffered disproportionately from this, a lot of out-of-school children has increased tremendously on the continent. And in fact, if you take a look at it, like only 7 out of 27 countries have schools open by the end of October. And you'll have 9 million kids, right, that are not in school in places like Niger, Mali, and in Burkina Faso. And 12 million kids that have missed school for the entire 4 months in places like Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso as well. So that has affected it. And in terms of the performance, as they also moved out of the COVID-19, everything went virtual. People started using digital information platforms to deliver education. But of course, that's good if you have it. Challenge is that 25% of the primary schools only have electricity. Only 40% of secondary schools have electricity. And you look at those kids that are supposed to be learning, 89% of their households have no access to computers, and 82% of those children have no access to laptops to be able to do anything. Now, about 28 million of these learners are within areas without access to mobile networks. So we are going to see the impact of that in terms of performance of the educational system at the end of the day. All I just want to say is that a lot needs to be done in terms of infrastructure to enable digital learning going forward.
Yeah, it sounds like an almost insurmountable challenge, but do you think in the end, positive things can come out of that?
Absolutely. I think we are continuing to invest massively on the continent. The bank actually put up, we announced a $10 billion facility, crisis response facility to support countries to that. We also launched a $3 billion global social bond to fight COVID-19, which is the largest social bond that's US denominated, dollar denominated in world history. So we continue to push money into that. But the fact of the matter is that there are so many competing needs, Adam. And so the Africa needs some breathing room. While developed countries have trillions of dollars, over $10 trillion to do fiscal stimulus, right? All Africa needs is $145 billion. And it's so difficult to even get that. So unless and until we make sure that Africa gets support to free up that fiscal space, it's going to be competing, limited amount of money competing for health, for education, for infrastructure, and all of that. So we'll continue to work with all the partners. I'm a very positive person, and I know at the end of the day, we'll get some resources to get things back on the right track.
Thank you very much indeed. So my last question was going to be, what do you need people to do to help? And it sounds like you've made that pretty clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Africa does need a lot of global support on a number of areas. I think maybe I'll just mention three. The first is making sure that, we can have physical distancing, social distancing, right? Which is all we have to do, but we cannot have physical distancing. So which means that Africa needs a lot of support, being able to get the resources to do it. The speed and the quality of recovery will depend on how much we are able to mobilize resources to deal with this. The second, of course, is that we need to also support Africa to deal with the issue of quality healthcare infrastructure. Health infrastructure is the basic thing. primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare infrastructure. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that particular area. And third, and for me, most critical, is that a lot of the young people need more jobs on the continent. So we need to make sure that the educational system is retooled. We need to make sure that we have people with technical and vocational training support systems, and make sure that we also support kids to have entrepreneurship capacity to create businesses of their own. And that's why at the African Development Bank, we are going to be supporting countries to launch what we call youth entrepreneurship investment banks. These are going to be new types of banks, specialized banks, that will create financial ecosystems around young people on the continent. We got 486 million of them. Those people coming up by 2050, that must be an asset for the continent for us to be able to unlock. And so I think in terms of youth employment, that's going to be a big one for us, and also invest in digital infrastructure.
Akin, thank you very much indeed. You packed an enormous amount into a very short space. Thank you. So we've just heard Akin Adesina tell us about the effects of COVID-19 on Africa. And of course, everybody listening has their own story about how COVID has affected their own education or the education of people they know and love. And we thought it would be interesting just to take three representative participants in the meeting and have them tell us about how the pandemic is affecting their world at the moment. So I'm very happy to have Daphne Koller, Frances Arnold, and Asha Kanwar with me. And let's start with you, Frances. How is the pandemic affecting you?
Adam, what we've learned is we can learn at home, but not all the time. Because science, it's all about collaboration and learning from experience and experiments, and that's pretty hard to do from home. And while we're all grateful for tech tools like Zoom and Slack, which have made it possible to connect virtually, in the end, we need to be together, especially younger scientists, because the conferences, the forums, the events that bring us together, including the social components, help build that local and the international network. But one upside I've seen, though, is that we're connecting across the world in a way we simply didn't do before. Yesterday, I was on a call, on a webinar with 1,000 people from Brazil to Bangladesh. It was wonderful.
Yeah, and this meeting is a wonderful example of connecting people. It's funny that we've connected you three, and you're all, in fact, along the west coast of North America. But how nice to have you all here. Daphne, how about you?
So I can speak to this from two different perspectives. One is from my own personal experience, and one is from the experience of my two teenage daughters who were in high school at the time that the pandemic broke out. So I'll start with my own personal experience, which I think is very similar to what Frances said, which is we do need, as we engage with other people, especially in the context of a scientific endeavor, that brainstorming interaction is so difficult to do when we're all relegated to, blocks of this size on a computer screen, and there's no body language, no ability to jump up and draw something on the board. And I think it's been a challenge to maintain the same level of energy and excitement and engagement that we've had. But at the same time, it does open up opportunities to interact with people in a more, with a less energy barrier that are on the other side of the globe, because before there would be an expectation to get on the plane and now there isn't. And that's, I think, a big upside, which hopefully might help us with another long-term crisis, which is the climate crisis, if we all get on planes a little bit less. I'd like to speak to the experience, though, of my two teenage daughters who were both in high school at the time that this broke out. The older one is now in college. And they moved to what we call Zoom school. And these are both, they're smart kids, academic high performers. And it was just striking to us to realize a few weeks into this that they would both turn on their camera at the beginning of the class, say a few words so the teacher would know they're there, turn off the camera and the microphone. The younger one was busy perfecting her Sims game, and the older one was going through the Netflix catalog. So I think what we learned from this is that it's very difficult for teachers, and I think they've gotten better, but it's still a huge challenge to maintain engagement and connection with students through a video screen. And how does one really build a learning platform that really creates that ability to do distance learning effectively versus using sort of a video conferencing platform that was built for a completely different purpose. I think we need to think much more deeply about how to employ the right kind of pedagogy for an online existence that is very, very different than face-to-face teaching, especially, as you said, Frances, with younger children.
And it's not just education that's doing that, right? I'm flipping through the Netflix catalog myself on most of my Zoom meetings.
I'm just impressed that you knew what your teenage children were doing. I mean, that's quite advanced. I want to come back. I want to come back to you in a minute, Daphne, because you were, as the founder of Coursera, the largest supplier of MOOCs in the world. This is a fantastically interesting experiment that's going on for you, I imagine. So Absolutely. Let's come back in a minute. But Asha, in your world, the Commonwealth of Learning has this extraordinary, diverse field to work with, a huge range of countries. What have you experienced during the pandemic?
It's so different because 48 out of these 54 member states, which span all regions of the globe, are developing countries. And in some of them, access to the internet is less than 10%. So, how did we continue our work? The Caribbean is slightly better. And of course, teachers needed a lot of capacity building. So we were able to do online courses in Trinidad and Tobago, where, over 8,000 teachers were trained, which is about half the teaching task force in the country. In India, we work with women farmers, and in the past, this had to be in person. Now we used Mobi MOOCs because, what Daphne was talking about, what kind of platforms do we need? And this Mobi MOOC, is a basic mobile interface which has social media integration, and it works in low bandwidth situations where people can learn in their local languages. In the Pacific, again, where access to the internet is very low, the real issue was lack of quality content. And there we curated content and aligned it to the curriculum of Fiji, Nauru, Samoa, and provided a video on demand service, which actually helped. So what we are trying to do is, and of course, in some cases, it's just face-to-face. In Bangladesh, we were working on boat schools where children were picked up in the morning and dropped back in the evening, after studying in those boat schools. Now the same boats, because the children can't be brought in, the teachers are being picked up from their homes and taken to communities where they teach for 45 minutes, 6 children sitting on mats, observing social distance, and then they move to the next group. So we've had to sort of, look at a whole range of technologies for print because the parents can't help them. So they're using tattered textbooks. And this is the way we've tried to ensure that nobody gets left behind.
It sounds as if good things are coming out of this.
Well, crisis always generates creativity, doesn't it?
But do you feel that children are getting the necessary education? If you cut the time with a teacher to 1/5 of the time, can you really do that?
The other thing which has happened, Frances, during this whole pandemic is this whole kind of tide has turned in favor of self-directed learning. In the past few centuries, we've been looking at the didactic mode. But if you actually were to sort of look at the time we spend in school, it's about 18%, of our waking hours between grades 1 to 12. And then, of course, that keeps reducing as we go to higher levels. So is this an opportunity for us where we are not able to provide that kind of, the full didactic services to sort of now look at education as a blend of formal, non-formal, and informal learning, which means a different paradigm from what we are facing now. So we have teacher-led sequential learning, where the teachers are coming for 45 minutes, and then unstructured learner-led approaches. So this actually takes us to this whole lifelong learning approach, which we've been talking about. Sustainable Development Goal talks about lifelong learning for all by 2030. But it's not clear how we are going to operationalize it. So I think if there's a silver lining in this pandemic, it's certainly this, that people have sort of pivoted to self-directed learning. And we really need to think of how we can sort of, build on these foundations to have a different educational system, which is, a lifelong learning system.
Daphne?
But I think one of the challenges with that, thank you, Adam, the challenge with that, Asha, especially with younger children, is they don't necessarily have the learning skills and the discipline to stay engaged and focused on the material on their own. And one of the challenges that I've seen with some of our employees with young children, mine are older and they just go off and watch Netflix, as we said, but the younger ones, they come and they interrupt their parents every few minutes saying, can you explain this question to me? Can you, what did the teacher mean? And that makes it very difficult for parents. And when I think about the situation of children with parents who don't necessarily have the educational background to provide that level of support to their children, it creates not only a challenge for the parents, but also creates a sort of inequity in learning outcomes for the children who are able to get that level of support from their parents and the ones who are not. And so while I love self-directed learning, I think, and it works well for some self-motivated children or ones who have that extra level of support, I think we really need to come up with a way of creating a pull towards learning that involves teachers, maybe involves parents, but ideally doesn't rely on the scaffolding of the parental unit in order to ensure student success. Because I think that reliance is really problematic for working parents and even more problematic for children who have parents who are unprepared for that type of challenge.
Frances?
But yeah.
I couldn't agree with that more. What we see is that children that come from, say, more chaotic households or whose parents don't have the education or time or ability to help their children, they get left behind even more. And so it's leading to enormous disparities for the children.
Exactly. We saw that with our nanny's child. It's really challenging.
That's true because, sorry.
Please go ahead.
What I was saying is that, thousands of people have been displaced, migrant parents. Obviously, they can't help the children. But another constituency which has become very important during this pandemic is the parents. And if we were to go into this lifelong learning mode, parents could become very important stakeholders in all this teaching learning process, because all parents are not possible. And where these cases, where parents were unable to teach the children, what countries have done is they've put loudspeakers where teachers are speaking, around a big field with loudspeakers to children sitting on mats, in the field. But people have tried all kinds of methods, even newspapers. Teachers are printing their lessons in newspapers in local languages, and then those newspapers go to the parents, and then children get their lesson. Okay, I'm grade 9. I've got my lesson today from my teacher in the newspaper. So people have been quite creative, I think.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you all so much. Absolutely fascinating. And this issue of inclusion and what to do about the growing inequalities is going to be very much a theme of today's discussions. And the audience will at times be able to give us their reflections on what COVID has done to them. But thank you all for the moment very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.